Hello and welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast. My name is Naweed Shibakil. We're pleased today to welcome Professor Rory Miller to our podcast series. He's Professor of International Politics, Director of the Energy Studies Certificates Programme and Co-Director of the Small States Research Programme at Georgetown University in Qatar. He teaches and researches on international relations, small state and regional security, international security and alliances and theories of external intervention. Welcome to the podcast, Rory.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to participate in this. It's a particular interest of mine and super relevant for what we do here. Also like to thank the Al-Attiyah Foundation for the invitation.
We're very happy to have you. And of course, you're no stranger to the foundation as we've partnered with you and Georgetown University in Qatar on several projects over the years. Let's start then with a major topic, an important one for Qatar and the region, the Gulf region, that is sovereign wealth funds. Small states are rich, but all look for inward investment, especially as they try to diversify their economies. Speaking generally then, does the direction of investments by influence as well?
I mean, this is a key question for decision makers in small states that have surplus financial resource. I think we need to start by defining what we mean by influence. And in the context of sovereign wealth funds, I think the important measure is the extent that others take you into account before they act. In other words, are your investments located strategically or importantly in areas that you have some influence and input in? I would argue that, yes, that's the one measure of influence that small states with sovereign wealth funds do have. As a stakeholder or a shareholder, you have a say in that particular sector, but more generally, as an important investor in a country or sector, your preferences will be considered. Now, whether that results in political influence is a different issue, perhaps in certain contexts and circumstances, but what I would say is there's another side to this. Remember what the goals of sovereign wealth funds are: to build wealth for future generations. So with this, I think a priority for small states is they have a long history of trying to avoid politics with their sovereign wealth funds, especially engaging in areas that are controversial or have political fallout, in part because the primary mandate is profit, but also because political fallout can cut off a sector or exclude you from a profitable sector in the future. Now, the final thing I'll say is, of course, sometimes investments are benign, well-intentioned, but they have the political fallout. And one I think of in relation to Qatar was the investment in the Shard in the city of London in 2010-11. It seemed like a very innocent investment at a time of financial crisis, but the local population took offense at such a big building being built in their midst, and Qatar was one of the recipients of that protest. But overall, profit, not politics, I think, is the way to go.
And you mentioned political influence there and politics often coming with the money that's spent. Many small states also are significant purchasers of armaments, sophisticated, expensive arms. Do you think these purchases engender the sort of political influence over and above positioning of things where money is spent on more benign matters, as you say, on training schemes, personnel in purchasing countries?
Well, I think compared to sovereign wealth funds, this is a much more obvious case. There is a clear intention that defense procurement can be used as a form of influence buying. And not only by small states, by all states engaged with other actors. But arguably, we have many examples of it. The most recent important one was Trump and Saudi Arabia a few years back, when the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia made a big publicity over the massive Saudi promises of up to $400 billion on US weapons. So it's a very clear part of defense procurement. But of course, for small states, they need to be careful because they're super vulnerable compared to larger actors. They lack strategic depth and they have many, many needs of weapons that other actors may not. So if you focus your security on buying friendship through buying weapons, rather than buying the right weapons, you face problems on the road ahead. And I'd say one other thing, it's also the case that over-reliance on any weapons providers creates dependence. And there's a very political element to this, such as conditionality. Who you engage with in the military and non-military sector, who you trade with, what you sell, what you buy. And such conditionality can very much constrain a small state trying to develop itself.
And one other area of security, perhaps, focusing on international security, we've seen energy rise up terms of importance for many states all across the world, particularly if you think about the fallout of the war in Ukraine and European countries looking to ensure energy security and supply chain security when it comes to energy. Contracts to purchase fossil fuels, they're seen as an integral part of energy security for lots of countries. When these contracts are signed or given away, is it often a influence factoring into that for these countries that sell energy supplies, or is it usually as straightforward as the highest bidder wins?
Okay. I mean, I would say contracts going to the highest bidder is a standard practice, to be honest with you, not only for commercial reasons, but for strategic considerations in small states. Most small states that are lucky enough to have significant natural resources depend on those resources in the absence of many other ways to produce surplus revenues. So they're super dependent for their income on these, and they do not want to be playing politics. However, in normal circumstances, when you do not want to be playing politics with such a key source of financial revenues, I think where we have to look at it is in abnormal circumstances. In special cases where your goals and your interests demand that you use whatever resources you have to achieve your needs. And what are those needs? Well, protecting your identity, ensuring your economic and political autonomy, building resilience. And in those cases where you have to do that as a priority, decision makers do consider energy and energy contracts as a strategic instrument and think of it in political and security terms beyond economic returns. If you go historically, you can look at Saudi Arabia in the 1970s, thinking about the price of oil in relation to US election cycles. More recently, and I think it's a very good example, one can think of Qatar. Qatar was widely noted as a country that only sold gas to the highest bidder because it was so important to its overall development. But when the blockade of Qatar started in 2017, there was serious consideration given to binding Qatar to its customers, important partners around the world, by being more involved in the distribution of contracts. And so you will see in matters of emergency, and I'll just say one final thing, because the discussion has another dimension. Even when contracts do go to the highest bidder, they also have a strategic value. Because energy actors, smaller energy actors, see their energy role as binding themselves to other actors in the international community as a way to enhance and increase their security, making themselves interdependent with those other actors and having those other actors have an interest in their security and stability.
And we've seen that, I guess, with the attempt by several European states to move away from Russian energy supplies, although that hasn't been the case for many other countries around the world, but perhaps an example of the strategic importance of Russia for some of those economies. But as a seller of fossil fuels, as a seller of any good, really, flexibility is important. And we know that providing oil or gas by pipeline might be a safer way of doing things, a more long-term way, a secure way, but being able to switch destinations and move it around via tankers is another alternative that might be enticing for small states in particular. Do you think that approach, the tanker-based sales approach, is a better attempt to attain prices and influence?
Well, I mean, prices is one factor, influence is another, but the practicalities, of the world we live in, 90% of all trade goes over the oceans. And the tanker fleets are developed now in such a way to maximize the financial benefit of using tankers. I mean, of course, one of the issues with tankers is the vessel supply. And so it's a function of how many tankers there are in relation to supply and demand. And what we're seeing now is a lot of tanker new build activity, and because of favorable market conditions more generally. At the same time, what you see is this makes the spot price of LNG in particular quite non-static or stable, because they'll go up and down to reflect the availability of carrier supply and shipper demand. So you have this, I guess you could say, double-sided reality, whereas on one hand, the flexibility of tankers provides for keeping the cost down, but on the other hand, the desire to have access to tankers and the great demand increases the price. But I think you have to understand another point, the psychological issue here. For some reason, historically, what happens to ships on the ocean captures the thinking and the headlines, and it has a psychological impact. whether you're talking about Somali pirates in 2010 or the Houthi in the Red Sea in 2024, the negative perceptions of instability on the oceans is far greater than the actual practical impact it has on demand and supply. So you're also factoring in another risk when you're dealing with tankers. But overall, the flexibility of tankers allows not just new markets, but also keeping prices stable where all other things are equal.
Yeah, and those maritime trading links, how important are they, would you say, for small states when they look at obtaining political influence? Qatar being a good example, an island nation, but also other Gulf states really developing ports and looking at how they can boost their influence through the maritime world. How important is that?
Well, let me say three things here. The first is this. Some small states are landlocked states. So they're not going to have this opportunity. And that's even creating tensions themselves when they're interacting with states with oceans, like we see in East Africa at the moment. So that's one issue. A lot of small states historically, in particular Commonwealth states, are small island states. And so what you have is you have two kinds of actors. You have the actors like Qatar that are energy producers with a coastline, and then you have small island states that have no energy resources but are trying to develop their opportunities in the blue economy, the maritime economy. And so you have these two overlapping but distinct aspects. And as I said, 90% of the world's trade takes place in the oceans. What small state energy producers have done recently is prioritize their maritime energy and non-energy sectors into what we call, in the academic world, vectors of post-oil identity. How do we use the maritime domain to move away from our oil identity? And what you see is a build-up in state-of-the-art port facilities and infrastructure, next-generation maritime technology is very fascinating in the Gulf, UAE in particular, maritime sustainability programs, and overseas ports and other facilities, binding you to your partners, creating relationships through the maritime domain. And there are 2 points here. These programs are ostensibly conceived as ways to achieve economic diversification out of energy. Build up your port economy. I'm currently leading on a project on the port economy of Qatar and building resilience on a national level. But what you also see is this idea is anchored in a view of the maritime domain, not only as a source of resources or a transport route, but the maritime domain is a soft power asset in itself, because it's an asset that connects you to important partners and fosters interdependence and contributes to national resilience. So it's quite a sophisticated way. And I would just conclude this by saying one thing. Traditionally, small states were viewed to have an inactive or at best reactive approach to the international arena. Put your head down, deal with domestic issues, and if you had any influence at all, as it was an issue area influence, oil or gas or diamonds. But now there's a whole new rethinking of how small states engage outside their borders and on the oceans. Can be flexible, innovative, smart. And so they're starting to think flexibly and innovatively and smartly about the oceans. And that's the future thing to look at because it's super engaging.
And also thinking more flexibly and smartly about their own economies and their futures. If you look at small states that are fossil fuel rich, a lot of their strategic and political influence comes from those very fossil fuels and the ability to sell those. As we move towards a net zero future, a potential decline in those sales, will that mean their political influence diminishes? And also, how important does that then make this desire to diversify their economies towards perhaps knowledge or science-based economies? And are there any examples of nations that have done that successfully?
Okay, I mean, let's put it this way. The first thing I would say in that regard is it's not always clear how much political influence came with being an energy-rich actor. In the mid-1970s, when the Arab oil-producing states first became influential energy producers in terms of controlling the price and the supply, the production of oil, there was real international concern that this would be translated into political power. It didn't actually happen in the way that was feared or predicted. What you have is influence in a certain sector and the financial resources to do other things that you would not have been able to do. Build up your army, buy armaments, set up embassies around the world, host events. So that's where the influence lay. But there's no doubt that the model that has been preeminent since the 1970s is being challenged. Does that mean that powerful energy producers will decline? I think it depends on 2 or 3 factors. And briefly, one is, to what extent can these actors be successful in transitioning into renewables? There's a window of opportunity for them all to establish themselves as key players in different areas, solar, hydrogen, whatnot. The second is their success in keeping a share of the fossil fuel business. You know, right now, a number of small state energy players are prioritizing not renewables, but how much market share they will have in a shrinking fossil fuel business in the next 30, 40 years. I've heard senior executives say this. Our priority is not revenues, it's not profit, it's market share in 2040. So these two together, balancing moving into renewables and holding on to what you have and even increasing your area in a shrinking fossil fuel market. And one factor I think is interesting to consider is competition. A lot of these small energy producers are competing with each other just in renewables like they competed in gas and oil. And this may be a driver towards becoming a market leader, or it may hinder the correct investment in the correct areas. If you're trying to counter your competitors in solar, but the right way for you to go is in another area. So these are the things to consider in that regard. Now, your second question is it possible for small energy producers to convert their energy into knowledge-based science economies? Look, this is hard. What we have seen is small energy producers are much more successful in turning from oil to gas than turning out of energy into non-energy and economic sectors. Qatar is a perfect example of that. The second thing that is clear is that diversification is one of the few things everybody agreed on what it means. I found a document once from the 1970s with the Saudi government talking about diversification and what they need to do. They still need to do it, and they're still talking about the same things in 2024. So there's no lack of clarity on what needs to be done. The lack of clarity comes on how you're going to do it and who has the political will to take the hard decisions. How do you attract the right technology at the right price? And it's super challenging because small states have a real disadvantage because they've small domestic markets, high production costs, low economies of scale, low levels of industrial production to start with. So you're talking about big challenges. That said, it can be done. We see big countries like US, Germany, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, even India, all transitioning from primary economies to more high-tech economies. In the smaller area, you see more likely, and I've looked at this a lot, you see it's more likely for energy consumers like Ireland, the Netherlands, Singapore, Chile, all have good track records of a diversification. Even South Korea, which is marginally a small state, sometimes it likes to consider it one, have all done quite well in diversifying, much less so in energy producers or countries that are most reliant on energy, you know. Sorry, go ahead if you want to add to
Sorry, yeah, just a bit of pick up on that. There was an interesting thing you mentioned there about the characteristics of small states and the domestic economy and the size of the domestic market. Often, briefly, if we can, they've had to augment their workforces with expatriate workers as well. And that's something we've seen in states like Qatar and other smaller Gulf states. How does that influence their potential futures and the political influence in particular?
I mean, look, expatriate workforces are a function of only one thing, a lack of human capital. They're not charity. They're not giving a home to anybody. We need workers in different sectors, and we take what we need, and we don't take more than we need, okay? So plain and simple, it's a function of the human capital needs. Diplomatic, security, political consequences are a necessary offshoot of that, and sometimes they provide opportunities for positive diplomatic engagement. Where countries where you have a lot of their citizens working, it gives you an opportunity to build cultural and other relations. But there's also negatives. I mean, it's common sense. If you have nationals of countries poorly treated or having a hostile environment or going back with negative stories, it's not going to endear the country to the home nation. But these are all relatively minor issues in the wider context of state-to-state relations and the vital need of having big expat working populations in order to fund development, to fund growth, to fund diversification. So on the scale of things, this issue is minor and one that can be easily addressed and easily absorbed.
And managed as well, perhaps, with regulatory.
And managed. Although sometimes it's the attempt to manage them that causes the most tensions with the other countries.
Yeah, of course, and that's something you see from time to time with South Asian nations and workers in the Gulf or countries like the Philippines. But let's touch upon a few other areas before we finish, because I know there's quite a bit to get through. Political influence, such a vast topic. Rory, one area where we've seen influence on the international stage in recent years has been sports. That relationship between sports and politics, traditionally in recent decades, has been quite apparent. If you look at the ping pong diplomacy between the US and China in the 70s, perhaps, but more recently, hosting mega events like the World Cup in Qatar recently, or Saudi Arabia winning the rights to host the event in 2034, and what's been said about that, but also foreign sports teams purchasing them. And if you think of Paris Saint-Germain and Qatar, or Manchester City in the United Arab Emirates, does sports play a major role in obtaining political influence or buying foreign sports teams? Does that mean that you gain power on the international stage?
Let me put it this way. We have, as you pointed out, we have vast investments all over the world in different kinds of sport, which would seem to indicate that decision makers are all in agreement that this is money well spent. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing I would say, it is money well spent. All other things being equal, this is going to be good for you. But in times when all other things are not equal, when you have more significant differences on economic or political or energy issues, this, I do not think, overcomes those challenges in any great extent. What it does do is it put a spotlight in a country. Why is that important? Because there is a broadly held view among small states that the more visible they are, the more secure they are. Because it means that people have an interest in what happens to them, and people have a vested interest in what happens to them. So in that regard, it's a form of soft power. If people like what I'm doing in sport, they like us. If they like us, they care about us. If they care about us, we may have them on our side in future crises. That is simply the calculation. Of course, leaving aside the financial and other criteria. But you've got to remember one thing, and we've seen it very clearly in this particular area. Soft power in the form of sport investment is still a form of power. It creates jealousy, it creates tension, it creates competitors. And so what you're seeing is you have to navigate a very middle road between maximizing the impact and putting yourself in the spotlight for your own security and interest, and not increasing your profile to your own detriment. What if you put your country in a spotlight and you end up earning significant criticism for your domestic policies? Or you create tensions with your neighbors who are jealous because you're in the spotlight and they are not. So there is a negative aspect that can be very quickly triggered if you don't handle it right. But in terms of foreign sports teams, the same is the same. You know, if you start having the media in a country talking about your domestic policies when every time your sporting team is brought up, that is not good. On the other hand, for the vast majority of people who are interested in sport, all they see is you associated with a positive name. There's a famous story about a Gulf airline that spent huge money on having a very famous sporting team fly around Asia on its airplanes, because it understood that every time the entire Asian continent associated its airplanes with this team, it was good for them. So there's no doubt it has a certain impact. I'm not sure it has a significant impact overall. Yeah.
And it's so the branding opportunities perhaps that may be worth weighing up against some of the potential detrimental effects that you've touched upon there as well. But some of these teams we're talking about are globally recognized and some of the most popular sports teams in the world. But let's touch on another thing you said there, and briefly, if we can, just to get a couple of questions in. Soft power. Sports is seen as a tool for soft power. Does investing in soft power offer a more realistic, plausible, safer way for small states to gain influence on the international stage? If you think about arts and culture and sports and trying to soften their image, if you like.
Look, it's the lowest common denominator. These small states, even energy-rich small states, don't have hard power capabilities that would be required to achieve objectives. They also don't have a culture where they want to, use military bases and naval security. This is not what they have. What they have is the luxury of extra financial resources due to their energy resources, and that can be invested in ways to increase their positive image on the international world. But culture traditionally is the lowest common denominator. The European Union used to send around its European orchestra in the absence of any other alternatives, right? And it's not that much different. So cultural exchanges, tourism, all of these things are helpful, positive, but they don't count for much when it comes down to the realities of realpolitik on a day-to-day level, at all, I would say.
Yep. And just finally, then, if we can, one other area that we've seen small states try and be active is in the sphere of humanitarianism and crisis response. Is that active response to crises and offering humanitarian aid, which we've seen again from many Gulf actors, even now with what's happening in Gaza, does that gain political influence?
Look, this is a whole different level of significance, impact, and challenge than cultural exchanges and these other forms of soft power. It's many ways what you are doing when you are mediating, when you're providing significant humanitarian aid, is that you're proactively looking to protect your identity, to protect your security, protect your independence. It's also a way to demonstrate your value and your moral standing, to build your reputation as a contributor of positive involvement in the international system. But the downside can be really high, and we've seen it a lot. One is accusations of meddling in domestic affairs. And you can go from the savior to the bad guy very quickly in these fraught political environments. Another is angering stronger local or international actors. There's a number of small Gulf states who've involved themselves in long-running conflicts, who've alienated strong Arab states who believed that was their domain of influence. You upset your domestic constituencies who disagree with your policies. And finally, you create jealousies the same way as having, mega events creates jealousies among those who aren't thinking innovatively and rapidly acting to involve themselves and demonstrate their value. So while the gains are high and the contribution to the wider security can be significant, it's a very challenging path to take, but it's a path that small states understand they might need to do because they have to be proactive. They cannot wait and sit back for things to happen to them. And by demonstrating, and I would like to say one thing to conclude, demonstrating value, demonstrating usefulness is one of the most important ways that small states use their energy surpluses now.
Yeah, but good note to end on then. I think that makes a lot of ground that we've covered in this fascinating discussion, starting off with energy and the importance of that for small states, touching on some of the other issues, perhaps softer power issues like sports and cultural programs, and then also looking at humanitarian responses. But a fascinating discussion. As always, Rory, thank you very much on behalf of the Al-Attiyah Foundation for joining us today and providing our listeners with your views about how small states are gaining political influence. The foundation very much looks forward to continuing this conversation with you again.
Thank you so much for your time, and also to the Al-Attiyah Foundation for all their support of our program in the previous year. So thank you very much.
And thank you very much for listening. As always, stay tuned for the next Al-Attiyah podcast interview in the series coming in the next few weeks. Thank you.